Hello, a very warm good afternoon to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to the special session where we are going to talk about all the various different conventions and protocols from the portion of environment ecology which are relevant for your prelims examination. Now, when the candidates prepare for the prelims, one of the most burdensome area is understanding what is this framework convention on climate change, what is this convention on biological diversity, what is CITES, what is CMS. There are so many conventions which are present and required for your examination that the confusion mounts higher and higher. And then also in the current affairs, you read about Conference of Parties number 15 for one of the conventions, Conference of Parties number 20 for one of the conventions, 29 for one of the conventions. So many of the time the confusion again erupts that what are these Conference of Parties, what are the various different protocols, and so on and so forth. So in this particular video, in a short time period, this is going to serve as the revision course for all the various different conventions and protocols. And we are also going to understand the timeline associated, why that is important to understand the timeline, and how you can classify the conventions for your better revision and for better consolidation of the content as well. Now, for all those who are preparing for the examination next year or the year after that, now, in case you want a detailed understanding of the GS subjects with conceptual clarity along with the mock tests as well as answer evaluation and mentorship, so we have come up with a unique offer for the flat 50% off along with 6 months of free extension. So you can avail all the various different GS lectures from your favorite educators, get the conceptual clarity and the depth which is required. Use the code IAS English to avail further discounts. Now, having said that, let us jump into the aspect of convention versus protocol. Now, you would have heard about it, that convention on biological diversity, and simultaneously you hear about terms like Kyoto Protocol, Paris Protocol, Montreal Protocol. Now, what are these? So, first of all, the very basic aspect of it, what is a convention? So, convention is an agreement, a kind of an agreement between various different countries and various different members, which is not as binding as a treaty, but slightly less than that, where you set a larger goal in order to achieve, let's suppose, an objective. That is a convention. Now, in order to achieve that goal, let's suppose you are changing some of the parameters of the convention, or you are setting a timeline to the convention about how that goal has to be achieved. That is what is referred to as a protocol. In simplest of the terms, the example that I oftentimes use is basically, let's suppose 5 of you get together and you decide to prepare for the civil services examination, right? Now, let's suppose you meet at one of those eatery joints, let's suppose a cafe coffee day, and together you decide that next year we will clear the civil services examination. Now, you have not decided how to clear it, which optional subjects to take, which GS subjects to complete first, when to go for answer writing. You have not decided any of the details, but you have a goal, you have an agenda to clear the civil services examination by 2026. So that will be your Cafe Coffee Day convention, CCD convention. Now all of you return home, and after a couple of weeks you realize that you have not decided about how to improve the answer writing, where to get the mentorship, where to go for, let's suppose, any kind of help and so on. So again, you guys meet, let's suppose, at another one of the eatery joints, let's suppose a Domino's. And you then set a timeline that in the next 4 months, I will complete the GS. In the next 6 months, I will complete the answer writing. Then I will appear for the optional paper and so on. So you are setting an agenda. You are setting a timeline. So that will be the Domino's protocol to the Cafe Coffee Day convention. So always a convention is for a larger objective which is to be met. Okay? And this involves goal setting of a goal. Then, when we talk about the protocol, it is generally used to change the terms of the convention, and simultaneously also fix a kind of a timeline. So whenever any particular convention talks about a targeted achievement of a goal, it is followed by a protocol. For example, Cartagena Protocol, Nagoya Protocol, Kyoto Protocol, Montreal Protocol, Paris Protocol, all these are examples of protocol, right? Change the terms of convention and also allocate a timeline for achievement of the goal, right? So that is a protocol. So first of all, that addresses our first question, that what is a convention, right? Now again, another term that you hear quite often is the conference of party. And this confuses the candidates in studying the current affairs. That COP 29 was in news, but there is some other COP 15 which is also in news. So which COP is what? Are all the COPs the same? So understand, the convention will have various different participating members, right? Generally, these participating members are the member countries. Now, these member countries are known as the parties to the convention. Parties to the convention. Now, these parties to the convention, basically, when you talk about it, now they will meet in order to decide, in order to go for the agenda setting, in order to decide what to do going ahead, what are the major areas to address, right? So, this members and these parties to the convention, they become the supreme deciding body. So that is why every 2 years, 3 years, in certain cases every year, you have a meeting of these members for each of the convention. Every convention will have the meeting of the members. So that is what is allocated as a conference of party to the convention or COP to the convention. Okay. Now, depending upon which convention it is, you have either a kind of an annual meeting, annual conference of party, for example, Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. It has got convention or conference of parties which are held annually. Every year, the parties meet. For example, in 2024, they met in Baku, Azerbaijan. So you would have heard about COP 29 at Baku. Similarly, when you talk about Convention on Biological Diversity, there the conference of parties happens every 2 to 3 years. Then Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. There the conference of parties is held every 3 years. Ramsar Convention, conference of parties is held every 3 years. So depending upon which convention we are talking about, accordingly the conference of parties is held for every different convention. Okay. So that is what is a convention, what is a protocol, and what is a conference of parties to the convention. Now, having said that, how to classify the conventions for your easier recollection and for easier consolidation of the text. So first of all, broadly it can be identified into 3 aspects. Now, why only 3 aspects, and what is the importance of these 3 aspects? So all of it stems from the Stockholm Conference in 1972. That Stockholm Conference of 1972 on man and environment, that is considered to be the mother of all the environmental actions and environmental conventions. Now, in that Stockholm Conference, you had 3 threats or triple threats which were identified for humanity. Now, which were these triple threats? First threat which was understood was pollution. The second threat which was identified was basically climate change. And the third threat which was identified was basically loss of biodiversity. Right? So, after the identification of these 3 threats, that is when the global action was initiated on each of these events and each of these threats. Now, accordingly, we have climate-related conventions, we have biodiversity-related conventions, and we have conventions associated with environmental pollution. For example, climate-related convention, when we talk about, you have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? When it was arrived at, what is the detail of it? We will talk about it. Biodiversity-related convention. Here, you have basically the Bonn Convention or the Convention on Migratory Species. You basically have again the convention associated with the biological diversity, that is CBD. and you have Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, that is CITES. Now, climate related convention, you can also include Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD. Then you have conventions associated with environmental pollution. Environmental pollution also causes a lot of damage. So that is where you have conventions which can be termed in the context of climate. So you basically have the Vienna Convention, then you have the Minamata Convention, then you have the Rotterdam Convention, then you have the Basel Convention, and you also have the Stockholm Convention. So these are some of the conventions associated. Other than that, you have another convention associated with the wetlands. That is the Ramsar Convention. That is what we refer to as the Ramsar Convention. So what we will do, one by one, we will take a brief look at all of these conventions, assuming that we have some clue about each one of them. And this is your revision capsule. So one by one, we will take a look at each one of them. And at the end of it, we shall be having a recap of the timeline and also the different types of conventions and what their goals are. Simultaneously, we shall also be validating our understanding with the help of some of the PYQs which have been asked from this particular area, so that you are also able to judge where your preparation level is. Now, first of all, the convention amongst all of them which was signed the earliest signing was that of the Ramsar Convention, which was arrived at in 1971. So when we talk about the Ramsar Convention, it is the convention on wetlands. Now, this convention was signed in 1971, 2nd of February, in the Iranian city of Ramsar. Now, when we talk about wetlands, they are very critical regions of biodiversity, where you have wide variety of species of flora as well as fauna, particularly birds, migratory species of birds. They are quite frequent in these areas. Now, it all started way back in 1960s. In 1962, you had a conference which was held in Vienna. So that is what is also referred to as the 1962 Mar Conference. Mar Conference. Now this is basically where the various different scientists, activists, NGOs, they came together and they talked about the importance of conserving and protecting the marshes, the bogs, the wetlands, the lakes, the ponds, if we wanted to conserve the biodiversity, that is the waterfowl species. For example, let's suppose the Siberian crane, let's suppose the sociable lapwing, all these kind of migratory species. So that is when for the first time it was held. That was the Mar Conference. Here Mar stands for marshes. That's it. Now, for almost a decade, there was basically the finalization of the text for this particular convention. Now here, the convention was signed in 1971 and came into force in 1975. Now, Australia was one of the first signatories of Ramsar Convention, and the first Ramsar site was declared in Australia. In India, the first Ramsar sites were declared in the early 80s when India became a party to this convention. And in India, the first Ramsar site, if you think about it, is basically Kyoto, situated in which particular state? Let us know. And also Chilika Lake. These were the first Ramsar sites which were considered. Okay, which were the wetlands were designated as wetland of international importance for conservation, or the Ramsar sites. Now you see, another important aspect that you have to catch for your prelims is that it is not a regulatory regime, right? It is not something which will give you certain regulations. If let's suppose India is party to the Ramsar Convention, India will not get a list of directives from Ramsar Convention. India will have to develop its own laws and it will have to enforce its own laws in order to ensure conservation of wetlands. Having said that, there are certain wetlands which require urgent attention, which require immediate conservation. And those wetlands, they are listed under a separate record, what is referred to as the Montreux record, which was launched basically in 1990. Now here, in this particular convention, you again have a protocol, that is the Paris Protocol of 1982. Not very important to learn about the Paris Protocol or go into the depth of the Paris Protocol. It simply added certain criteria based upon which the sites or the wetlands could be regarded or given the status of Ramsar site. So that was basically the case of Ramsar Convention. Now, UPSC had asked a question earlier, a very direct question about what does Montreux record deal with? And the answer for that would be wetlands requiring urgent conservation. So that is the case of the Ramsar Convention. Now, after that, we move ahead to the entire genesis. So this was in 1971, and now let's come forward from 1972 onwards. So 1972 was a very, very landmark year in terms of environmental conservation. Because in 1972, you had the Stockholm Conference which was held. Now, many countries participated, including India. And this is when identification of importance of human rights, identification of conservation of environment, as well as identification of the triple threats endangering the environment and mankind were identified. So that is why it is important. Now, Stockholm Declaration, which was issued at the end of the conference, that consisted of a wide-ranging issue from justice to banning apartheid, as well as talking about utilization of resources in a sustainable manner. But please understand, utilization of resources in a sustainable manner, that is something which was talked about. Sustainable development was not talked about. The concept of sustainable development comes almost 15 years later. So in this Stockholm Conference, this is basically the United Nations Conference on Human Environment that was held on 5th and 6th of June 1972. It is to commemorate this particular date and this particular event that we also celebrate the World Environment Day. Now, having said that, basically this also meant various different organizations coming into existence. One of the important organizations which came into existence as a result of this conference was United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, came into existence. Now you hear a lot about UNEP launched projects and UNEP led projects in various parts. So that is where UNEP came into existence. Now, as triple threats were identified, this is where all the countries, they started bringing in their own national legislations as well, in order to conserve the environment, in order to tackle, let's suppose, pollution and so on. As a consequence of this conference and the agendas discussed in this conference, see that India also passed the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, then followed by Water Conservation Act of 1974, Forest Conservation Act of 1980, Air Prevention of Pollution Act of 1981, Environment Protection Act of 1986, and at the same time, in the case of the Water Act of 1974, India also set up the Central Pollution Control Board, or CPCB. So same things were happening, or similar things were happening across the globe. US came up with its own National Environment Protection Act, under which the concept of environmental impact assessment was launched. So all the countries, they started taking action to protect the environment, to prevent climate change as a consequence of this Stockholm Conference. Now, having said that, after this, a substantial amount of time passed before the next action was taken. And the next major action was to understand how to balance nature conservation with environment or economic development. Because the era of 70s and 80s, that was marked with this particular debate that whether the country should focus on GDP growth or whether they should go for environmental conservation. That is when, in 1987, you basically had the Brundtland Report. Now, this is the first time when you had a clear-cut definition of what is sustainable development. That is why Brundtland Report is important. The concept of sustainable development. Sustainable development goals, however, came much later, right? Almost close to around they came into force somewhere around 2015 to be achieved by 2030. But then sustainable development in itself as a concept was highlighted by the Brundtland Report for the first time. Now, what is this Brundtland Report? Now, the Brundtland Report talks about sustainable economic development. That means, does that mean we don't use the natural resources? Absolutely not. That is not sustainable development. Sustainable development is when you are utilizing the natural resources in such a judicious manner that you have ample which is left for the future generation as well. You leave for the future generation what you have inherited from the past. So that means preventing over exploitation of resources and taking growth and protection of environment simultaneously. So this Brundtland Report finally put the nail to the coffin of the debate, that is, should we go for GDP or environmental protection? This report argued that both of them could be carried out simultaneously. So this was a major landmark because then environment was prioritized. But before the next set of conventions, they started coming in 1992. There was another change and another important event which happened immediately after the Brundtland Report. And that was the setting up of IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, this IPCC was set up in 1988. And in 1988, basically, it was set up as a consequence of coming together of UNEP and World Meteorological Organization. They brought in the IPCC. Now, why is it that the IPCC was set up? You see, even today when you talk about the concept of climate change, you will have various different naysayers. For example, the US president, who considers climate change as a kind of a hoax and as a kind of a conspiracy. So imagine what would be the condition in the 80s. There were very few believers of the fact, at least at the hands of the policy making, very few were believing the fact that climate change is a reality and the world will be destroyed if we don't cap that warming. So that is where IPCC consisted of a scientific body, and whereby scientific detailed research was carried out regarding the greenhouse gas emission, what are the changes in the level of warming, how is it that the temperature is increasing based upon the emission level, where is it that increased solar insolation is being received, where is it that positive feedback, negative feedback, to what degree, and so on. So that scientific detailed understanding was something which was carried out by IPCC. Now, this IPCC is known for carrying out a detailed report. For all the study that it does, it basically encapsulates it in a periodic report where it summarizes the actions taken, the conditions of global environment, and what can be the mitigation measures and what can be done by the policymakers. So that is what is referred to as an assessment report. Assessment report, right? So, or AR. Now, IPCC came up with the first assessment report in 1990 and 1991, because there are multiple different reports. So, for example, when we talk about the assessment report generated by IPCC, so first report is about the condition of the global environment, where all the detailed scientific readings in terms of the heating, in terms of the level of temperature rising up, the level of sea rising up, every detailed scientific record is mentioned in that. The second assessment, the aspect of the second report within that is about what are the areas which are going to be impacted by this, and what can be the mitigating measures taken by these countries in order to prevent this level of heating, prevent this level of warming. And the third part of the assessment report is a dumbed down version of this entire thing, a very brief compendium for the policymakers. Because think about the decision makers in any country. Do you think they will be able to actually fathom in or get in the idea about these scientific readings and scientific metrics? They need a broader outlook about what is happening and what is the decision to be taken. So that is the report for policymakers. So assessment report is released in a couple of years, right? It takes almost around 6 to 7 months for the entire assessment report to be released. So the first assessment report was released in 1990 and 1991. Now, this assessment report painted a very gloomy picture of the world. It basically said that if immediate action is not taken in order to stop the events of climate change and in order to prevent global warming, we are looking at the global destruction, rising sea level, destruction of habitats, and eventually the human population will also be impacted. Now, the world had never seen such a comprehensive report. So the world got alarmed. And immediately in 1992, commemorating 20 years since the Stockholm Conference, the world met in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil under the Earth Summit, or what is also regarded as the Rio Summit. So that is where the Rio Summit, which is well known for. Now, this Earth Summit or the Rio Summit was very important. Now, what is this summit? Conventions is understood, protocols is understood. What is this summit? Summit is always those kind of decision-making meetings which are held where the heads of the government, the heads of the state, they convene together. That is the name associated with the summit. Because if you associate the word summit and its immediate literal meaning, what does a summit mean? Top of a peak of a mountain. That is a summit, right? So that is why summit meeting basically means the coming together or convening of the global heads of state in general. So Rio Summit was conducted or was held on again 5th of June 1992, 20 years since the Stockholm Conference. Now this is known for the 3 documents which were signed, which were agreed upon. From this also UPSC has asked question, and also the famous 3 conventions. That is where the Rio Summit comes into force. Now, what were the 3 documents and what were the 3 conventions? Let us take a look at them. So first of all, the brief about the Earth Summit. So this was held at Rio de Janeiro, also known as the Earth Summit. And again, look at the duration, 3rd to 14th of June, with major meetings happening on 5th and 6th of June to commemorate Stockholm Conference. Now, which were the 3 documents first of all? So the 3 documents associated were the Rio Declaration, which talked about environmentally sound method of development without destroying the environment, how to go ahead with the economic development. That is the Rio Declaration. Then after that, you had the Agenda 21, right? Again, it was about sustainability. It was about what measures could be taken for encouraging this development and at the same time cleaning up the already created mess in terms of environmental parameters. That was Agenda 21. And then you had the forest principle, non-legally binding statement of global consensus on management, conservation of forests across the world. So the 3 documents. For any summit, you generally have a declaration. For example, in the G20 summit, which was held in India, you had the Delhi Declaration. So similarly, it was held in Rio Summit. So you had a Rio Declaration. Then you had Agenda 21 for cleaning the environment and paving out a pathway for development in an environmentally sound manner, and for properly managing and conserving the forest principle. These were the 3 documents which were arrived at. But what were the 3 conventions? The 3 conventions were United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where global warming was at the center of the agenda. Then United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, because it was understood that due to climate change as well as due to human activities of pollution, etc., the land across the world is getting degraded. The land quality is getting degraded. That is where Convention to Combat Desertification. And you also had the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in order to ensure sustainable use of biodiversity, protection of biodiversity, as well as the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits associated with the biodiversity to the indigenous population. So these were the major conventions which were laid out. Now, when it comes to Convention on Biological Diversity and Framework Convention on Climate Change, from the get-go, the funding agency for this would be GEF, Global Environment Facility, with World Bank as its trustee. World Bank would be the trustee. Right? Now, that was GEF. UNCCD, however, to combat desertification, it had an alternate source of funding for a long period of time. But in recent years, even CCD, United Nations Framework or United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, that is also funded by Global Environment Facility. So now you can say that the funding agency for all these three conventions is Global Environment Facility. Okay, so these are the three important conventions. Let us take a look at each one of them. Now, each of these climate convention is first we will take a look into it along with the protocol. Then we will deal with CBD separately with the other conventions dealing with biodiversity. But before that, what is this Convention to Combat Desertification? This talks about reducing the amount of land degradation. It sets an agenda for all the countries in order to achieve what is referred to as land degradation neutrality, LDN. That is, every year, whatever amount of land, let's suppose, goes through degradation, right? Which land degradation means there is excess pollution, the land cannot be utilized economically, anthropogenically, etc. So every year, huge amount of land across the world goes through degradation. Now, the countries, in order to achieve land degradation neutrality, what they have to do is, let's suppose every year 100 units of land have been degraded. They have to reclaim at least 100 units of already degraded land, so that no new addition of degraded land is there in the ecosystem. So that is the case of UNCCD. Here the conference of parties for UNCCD tends to happen every 2 to 3 years. So is the case with Convention on Biological Diversity. The conference of parties is held every 2 to 3 years here as well. But in the case of Framework Convention on Climate Change, the conference of parties is held annually. Annual COP. That is why recently you had the conference of parties number 29 to Framework Convention on Climate Change, whereas you had the conference of parties number 15 to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that tells you that there is a kind of a different pace, something which is held annually and something which is held every 2 to 3 years. Both are, all of them are in fact exclusive to each other. Okay. Now, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that talked about lowering the global temperature, putting a cap to global warming. And for that, what needed to be done? Greenhouse gases need to be stopped, or at least the cutting down of emissions. Now, convention sets a goal, a larger objective. In order to achieve that objective, what do you need? A protocol. So, at the third conference of parties to the UNFCCC, third COP to UNFCCC, you had basically the conference of parties was held in Japan. And that is where, for the first time, a comprehensive protocol for global warming was arrived at, and that is what is famously known as the Kyoto Protocol. So, Kyoto Protocol was arrived at in 1997. What did it talk about? So, the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted on 11th December 1997 and later came into force around 2005, was ratified by around 192 parties. It talked about cutting the greenhouse gas emissions. it mentioned explicitly for the first time the gases which needed to be controlled. So you basically had carbon dioxide and 5 other gases which were delineated here. Which were those? Methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, and perfluorocarbons. Now, a target was set for all the various different countries, developed countries that is, in order to stop the emission of those. And it was also said that those countries who are unable to meet the target, we will introduce a market mechanism. What is that? So basically, think about it. Let's suppose I give you a goal that in 5 days you have to finish the portion of geography. Now, if you are unable to finish the subject of geography in the 5 days, what will I be able to do? Right? And you also won't have anything as a kind of a punitive measure or any kind of a recourse that you can adopt. So that is why many of the countries earlier also, they had set lofty goals but were unable to achieve those goals. Now, Kyoto Protocol for the first time provided the concept of market mechanism, trading of carbon, whereby if let's suppose this is your target of emission and you have exceeded this much, right? So the remaining portion, that is what you can trade from someone who has emitted less. So that market mechanism was the introduction by the Kyoto Protocol. Now here, what was done was basically the principle of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility, was assigned. That all the countries are responsible for controlling global warming, but some of the countries are more accountable. That is, the developed nations, they are more accountable owing to the fact that they have historically and as a matter of legacy polluted the environment, due to which the entire world is suffering as of now. So that was the concept of CBDR. It is still a principle that is followed in global dialogues regarding climate convention. Countries like India, the developing countries of global south, they all urge the developed countries to follow this principle of CBDR and do more for global finance and global climate goals. Right? Now, that was Kyoto Protocol. Now here, 37 industrialized nations plus the European Union, they were assigned a target. Target of what? That you have to reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 5% below the 1990 levels. Whatever your emission was in 1990, reduce it lower than that by 5%. So this came into force when? 2005. So that automatically talked about going back 15 years in terms of the emissions that you were carrying out and reducing the level of emission. Then the planned period of implementation of the Kyoto Protocol would be from 2008 to around 2012-13. But what to do after that, after 2013? And what agenda to be taken up? So that is where in the Conference of Parties to Climate Change, which was held in Doha, you had the Doha Amendment which was passed. Doha Amendment is also famous and is important for the climate convention because Doha Amendment extended the planned implementation period of Kyoto Protocol up till 2020 for all the participating countries. Now, what to do after 2020? What is the global agenda to be taken forward after 2020? That is where you have the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015 in order to set the global agenda beyond 2020. So that is how you basically have all the various different aspects associated with climate to be dealt with. Now, under the protocol, the governments basically were separated into 3 different distinct decisions or divisions. You had the most developed nations, for example, US and so on. Now they were put under Annex 1, right? These Annex 1 parties, they had a target of reducing the emission and they had to achieve that target. So these were the countries who had the financial wherewithal, who had the technological prowess with which they could reduce the amount of emission. Then you had the second group, that is the Annex 2 parties, which consisted of OECD countries, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Members of OECD, members of Annex 1, they were also developed, but not the Eastern European countries, the economies in transition, they were not included. Now, they did not have a definite target that they had to meet, but they would help in financial and technological assistance to the other nations in order to adapt to climate change. And then you had the third group of countries, including India, China, Pakistan, and so on, who were developing or underdeveloped. They did not have a target to meet, but they were encouraged to reduce the amount of carbon emissions. So like that, a division-wise conditioning was set up regarding how to deal with climate change. Now, Kyoto Protocol is well known for the 3 market mechanisms that it brought into implementation. Now, what were the market mechanisms and what was the role of the market mechanism? So basically, imagine, let's suppose you consider a country like Germany. Let's suppose. Now, Germany has got this much as its emission target. Now, Germany exceeds the emission target substantially. It has emitted this much higher amount of greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, how will it make up for it? So that is where Germany would or could invest in either another developed country, let's suppose the UK, or could develop a kind of facility in a developing country like, let's suppose, India, whereby they could set up, let's suppose, a solar power plant or a wind energy plant. Now, these renewable sector, they would reduce the amount of emissions which would happen otherwise in India. Because India, if you think about it, is a growing economy. Every year, our energy requirements go higher up. So rather than setting thermal power plant, which will add to the greenhouse gases, why not Germany invest in a solar power plant, which will be emission free? So Germany will invest in India to reduce the emission by this X amount. And that is where India would provide Germany with credits. Or if it invests in UK, UK would provide it with credits. And that is how Germany would justify the exceeding of the target. Now, here you might have a very simple question, that if Germany is investing in India because it is exceeding the target, it is spending money. So why isn't Germany using that money to reduce its own emission? It can use its own reduce its own emission, then no need to invest in India. The reason for that again is simple. You see, if today India gets a target that you have to reduce your emission by 240 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, now India won't be able to achieve that in 1 year. What will you stop? Will you stop the vehicles from moving on the road? Will you stop the construction activities which are happening? Would you shut down your thermal power plants? Would you shut down your iron and steel plants? Obviously not. So even if you want to reduce emission, you have to set a 5-year agenda, 10-year agenda, and then you begin to act on that. For example, India is already looking forward to inclusion of electric vehicles in mobility solutions and so on. So it takes time. But what about this particular year when India, let's suppose, exceeds its target? So the concept behind it is that if I am not able to meet the target, I am reducing the emissions somewhere else on the planet so that overall the planetary emissions, they don't increase. That is the concept of market mechanism. Now, there are 3 types of market mechanism introduced under the Kyoto Protocol. You have the concept of joint implementation. You have the concept of clean development mechanism. And you have the concept of emission trading. Whatever extra emissions you carry out, you trade. Now, joint implementation in simplest of the terms is between 2 developed nations. That is Germany investing, let's suppose, in UK. 2 developed nations. Clean development mechanism is between a developed and developing nation. And emission trading is wherever you emit more, you can exchange that credit from a particular region which has not carried out that much emission and saved some amount of carbon credit. So in simplest of the terms, when we talk about joint implementation, so joint implementation, let's suppose an advanced country A is unable to fulfill its own target of carbon emissions, it will invest financially or will provide technological assistance to the advanced country B. In any of the emission reduction projects, solar plants, wind power plants, any of those categories. And after that, it will be given credit, right? Emission reduction unit is the name of the credit. So this is basically the credit. So let's suppose you have exceeded the target by X, you have to gain X amount of credit. At least like this, you will be able to attain your goal. Then after that, you have the clean development mechanism, where if an advanced country A is unable to achieve its target, then it will invest in developing country B, right? Like India or China. And in return, it will get a credit again, right? Certified Emission Reduction Units, CER. Now, this is where from or in the past decade to 2011 to 2020, India was one of the largest recipients of investments across the globe. After China, India was one of the largest issuers of credit as a consequence of clean development mechanism. So this helps developing countries also meet their developmental parameters, at the same time reducing their emission. But developing countries, they don't have any goal, right? And then you have the emission trading where any of the countries can engage in terms of buying the credit from any other country. For example, if one country has exceeded the target, this is the target, other country has basically overachieved, emitted much less, so it will earn this much amount of credit. This credit can be sold, right? In return, you will get money. Okay, so that is how climate and responsive action can be benefited. Now, as I told you, what to do after 2020, for that, the world arrived at the Paris Agreement, right? That was at the Conference of Parties number 21 to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Paris Agreement differed from Kyoto in simplest of the terminologies, where now it allowed the countries to set their own target. That all of you set your own target about how you are going to combat the climate change. For example, in putting it in a very simple analogy, let's suppose I give you, all of you, the target that in 1 week you have to finish geography. Now, some of you might say that this is very steep target. It was never to be achieved. Geography will take at least 1 month. Few of you will say, okay, I have achieved that. Few of you again will struggle and so on. Now, in that case, I might not hold you guilty because it might be very difficult for you to achieve. So that was the condition of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, in return, the changes which were done was what? For example, I tell you that in 1 month, you give me the target of what you will be able to finish, and I will hold you accountable to that. In that case, you have no escape. You have no escape that no, the target was too harsh. You yourself had set the target. So the countries were allowed to set their own target, provided there would be a global stock take after every 5 years, whereby it would be examined whether you have achieved the target or not. So that is where the concept of intended nationally determined contributions that came into existence. All the countries have to set up their own NDC. What is their contribution against climate change? Now, this is not legally binding. It is not as if you are unable to achieve the target, you will be prosecuted or you will be fined. Just the case that if you are unable to achieve the target, the next target that you set, that has to be steeper, right? Every 5 years, the countries have to submit their fresh set of targets. And after 5 years, there has to be a global stock take, that which country has achieved how much and which country is lagging behind. That was the basic concept of the Paris Agreement. Now, amongst the major economies of the world, India is the only major economy which achieved its nationally determined contribution and was actively disappointed, hugely disappointed, when nobody basically identified that. because the developed countries, they did not achieve their goal. So they simply changed the goalpost, that now we will focus on the concept of net zero. So Paris Agreement also highlighted the concept of net zero, which was first highlighted by the IPCC report. So what is this concept of net zero? So when we talk about net zero, this is about net zero emissions. So whatever amount of greenhouse gases or CO2 emissions you are doing, you ensure that in that year you have that much amount of carbon dioxide storage and capture, sequestration, by planting trees, by going for greener aspects, and so on. So emissions have to be equal to sequestration. That is net zero. Now, Paris Agreement actually advises the country to achieve this net zero goal by 2050. But countries, for example, China has declared it will achieve net zero in 2060. India has declared that it will achieve net zero when? 2070. Right? So that is where the countries decide the net zero goal, that we won't be adding any more greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. Whatever emission we will do, we will sequester. Net zero does not mean no emission. You will have the emission, but you will capture that emission as well. Capture that much amount of greenhouse gases as well. That will lead to cooling of the environment. Now, it is under this framework convention on climate change that Kyoto Protocol lies under it, that you have the Paris Agreement lying under it. It is under this where you have the recently held Conference of Parties number 29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, which was held. Right? So that is associated with Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now let us take a look at few of the PYQs, previous year question, and take a look at this and put that in the answer regarding what do you understand and what is the answer, what should be the answer for this. The term INDC is sometimes seen in the news in the context of pledges made by the European countries to rehabilitate refugees from the war-affected Middle East, plan of action outlined by the countries of the world to combat climate change, capital contributed by the member countries in establishment of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and plan of action outlined by the countries in order to achieve sustainable development goals. I hope this particular PYQ becomes absolutely solvable and easy after looking at the concept. But even take a look at these kind of questions. With reference to Agenda 21, sometimes seen in the news, consider the following statements. It is a global action plan for sustainable development. It originated in the World Summit on Sustainable Development held in Johannesburg in 2002. When is it that Agenda 21 came into existence and what is it about? So again, a simple kind of question. Third question. Consider the following statements. Sustainable Development Goals were first proposed in 1972 by a global think tank called the Club of Rome. The Sustainable Development Goals have to be achieved by 2030. So take a look at all of these three questions. Let us know what the answers are in the comment section below. I hope nobody faces problem in solving these questions. Now we come to conventions on biodiversity. So conventions on biodiversity, there are three such conventions. That is Bonn Convention or Convention on Migratory Species, Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna. That is CMS, CBD and CITES. What are they? So when we talk about the chronology of it, the earliest which was signed was CITES, right? 1973 itself. Then in 1979 came the CMS, and CBD we know came into existence at the Rio Summit 1992. Now, Bonn Convention or CMS. So, it basically is about, it entered into force in 1983. It was signed in 1979 itself. Now, this is about the migratory species. How do you conserve the migratory species? So, migratory species, let's suppose you consider a particular bird, right, which migrates during the winter from Central Asia to India. Now, if you protect the bird in Central Asia, but in India its habitat is destroyed, then the migratory species will die. Or what if somewhere in between here, Hunting is allowed in the regions like Afghanistan, Pakistan. Somebody hunts the bird down. Then how will you ensure conservation? So that is where it was identified and understood that when it comes to migratory species, you need a larger conservation and a convention for that conservation. So that was the key identification part behind the CMS. Now, it has legally binding agreements which the countries can arrive at, as well as non-legally binding MOUs amongst the member countries. What it does, it divides the species in terms of appendices, that is Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Appendix 1 includes those particular species which are in urgent requirement of conservation, who need to be conserved at any cost, otherwise they are at the threat of extinction. Appendix 2, on the other hand, lists those particular species which would be good for those species and their population if some or the other conservation practices are carried out. Now, under this CMS, it is not as if only the aviary species or the bird species are covered, because migration is carried out by the terrestrial as well as marine species. India is a party to CMS. So when we talk about some of the migratory species in India, for example, Amur falcons, which come from the region of eastern portion of Asia all the way to the region around Maldives. We have covered that in places in news separately as well. So they use the flyway, they take a stop in India, right? So that is one of those bar-headed geese, black-necked cranes, marine turtles, dugongs, humpback whales. All of these are under protection of conservation of migratory species. Do you need to learn for your examination which are the species under Appendix 1 or Appendix 2? Only the species in news, otherwise not. So that is something we are covering regularly with the portion of current affairs. Now, after this, you had the Convention on Biological Diversity, arrived when? As a consequence of Rio Summit, 1992. 1992. Funding agency, GEF, Global Environment Facility. Now here, you basically have three major goals which are to be achieved. Conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, as well as fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources. Now, how do you achieve those goals? So in order to achieve those goals, there was a kind of a protocol which was signed. So for this, you had, in order to ensure sustainable use of the components, that is the living modified organisms, you had Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. Right? This was also arrived at one of the conference of parties of CBD. Okay, so COP of CBD is different from COP of UNFCCC. Then fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the biodiversity. For example, let's suppose you have one of those unique medicinal plants in your locality. Now you should be able to utilize that, right? If let's suppose you are not using it, some multinational company identifies that plant, medicinal plant, and makes big bucks out of it. Now they will destroy the locality. So the local community should get the benefit associated. The traditional knowledge should be respected. So that is where, for this, in order to ensure this, you had another protocol which was arrived at, that is the Nagoya Protocol. Okay, so these are the two protocols associated with CBD, right? Now, by the way, just an anecdotal reference. In order to adhere to the principles of Convention on Biological Diversity, India had passed its own national legislation, that is the Biodiversity Act 2002. And that Biodiversity Act 2002 basically also had three objectives. These were the exact three objectives of the Biodiversity Act 2002. And under that, India had set up the National Biodiversity Authority, the State Biodiversity Authority, and the Biodiversity Management Committees at the district level. So you had the Biodiversity Authority at the central level, at the state level, and at the district level. so that the benefits could be shared, sustainable use can be ensured, etc. Now, individually, if we take a look at it, Cartagena Protocol. So, Cartagena Protocol was something which was adopted in 2000, right? Now, to ensure the safe handling of living modified organisms. For example, due to the development of biotechnology, you have various different genetic modifications which are done to the plants, to the animals, and so on. Now, these plants or modified animals, genetically modified animals like, let's suppose, a liger. Now, if you introduce them into the wild, they can wreak devastation. They can impact the other species as well. So that is why the countries were asked for an advanced informed agreement and a biosafety clearinghouse. What does that mean? Let's suppose I am a country A, there is another country B. Now I want to send one of the species into B as a trade mechanism or something like that. Now this species can wreak havoc on B. So B will have a biosafety clearinghouse. Biosafety clearinghouse. Now, this biosafety clearinghouse will be a scientific organization which will observe the modifications in the organism and how it will impact the biodiversity both in the short term as well as in the long term. After the biosafety clearinghouse is convinced, that is when there will be an advanced informed agreement between these two countries that yes, we agree to the terms and conditions and now we are okay to accept that particular species. Only then can you send the species. This is to ensure an informed decision making for before introduction of the species in any particular environment. So that is what is the key area of this particular protocol. Now you also have the Nagoya Protocol. Nagoya Protocol, very simple, sharing the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources in a very fair and equitable manner with the indigenous community, making the local population a part of the conservation measure. When was it adopted? It was adopted in 2010 at the Conference of Parties to CBD, which was held in Japan. Okay, so that is your Nagoya Protocol. Then we come to another convention, that is CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, because it was understood that majority of the wildlife is being killed because somebody is interested, let's suppose, in the tusk of the or in the case of ivory of elephants, somebody is interested in the tiger's skin, somebody is interested in another species, and it is traded. These endangered species are traded, and that is why they are at risk, be it the case of animals, be it the case of birds, and so on. And even the case of plants, for example. For example, we know that when it comes to the case of red sanders, it is traded because it is in great demand. Then when we talk about shisham, shisham is another one of those species of trees which is smuggled significantly. So that endangers the prevalence of those species. So in order to ensure that the species are conserved, CITES was arrived at. Now CITES came into force in 1975 and consists of 183 countries. It is legally binding on the parties. However, the member countries, they have to devise their own laws. They have to formulate their own laws for conservation. Remember, India had recently amended the Wildlife Protection Act. So, Wildlife Protection Act that is present in our statute, that is basically again to adhere to the principle of CITES. Also, for wildlife conservation, that is the prime goal. But time and time again, it is tinkered so as to adhere to the principle of CITES. So, Wildlife Protection Act is our own law. But the conditions of ensuring that the international trade does not happen, that is ensured by Wildlife Protection Act. But that is the overall aegis of CITES. Okay. So, India has been a CITES party since 1976. Here also, just like in the case of Bonn Convention, you have the species which are divided into 3 appendices. So, Appendix 1, if we consider which of the species are included, so species which require urgent attention, right? So, species that are in danger of extinction. Commercial trade is absolutely prohibited in these species. Okay. permits are required for import and export to be done. However, if a question is asked that under no condition species included in Appendix 1 can be traded or can be exchanged, is that true or false? That will be a false statement. Because in order to ensure research and development, trade can be carried out for the species. Okay, just to ensure research and development. So, the origin country who is sending that species, they have to ensure that the species does not get damaged. What does that mean? Let's suppose country A sends to India, let's suppose one of the species of cheetah, only for research, right? Not for any other factor, only for research. Now, it will be the onus on A to ensure that cheetah is not dead. So, I'm just giving you an example. That is not the case in terms of cheetah reintroduction plan, but that is the aspect of the species included in Appendix 1. Then Appendix 2 and 3, much more liberal. So, Appendix 2 states that the species that aren't facing imminent extinction but need monitoring. Trade permits can be obtained legally. Appendix 3, the species which are protected in at least one country, for example, carousel. Carousel is in abundance amount in West Asia, but it is significantly, the population is reducing in India. So, they can be included, right? So, regulations for these species vary, but typically the country where it is endangered, where it is protected, they can request for the listing. Okay, so that is the case here. Now, let us take a look at the PYQ which has been framed from here. Again, I hope you will be able to answer this. So, with reference to IUCN and the CITES, which of the following statements is or are correct? IUCN is an organ of United Nations and CITES is an international agreement between the governments. IUCN runs thousands of field projects across the world to better manage natural environments. CITES is legally binding on the states that have joined it, but convention does not take place of the national laws. So, think about it and let us know in the comment section below. Then, after that, we have the conventions associated with environmental degradation. Now, here you have various different conventions. Vienna Convention. Vienna Convention, please don't confuse this Vienna Convention associated with the diplomatic immunity and the treatment of the diplomats. This is a different Vienna Convention associated with the ozone hole depletion. You have the Minamata Convention for mercury poisoning associated with the Minamata disease. You have the Rotterdam Convention, Basel Convention, as well as the Stockholm Convention. Basel Convention is about banning the usage or the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. Rotterdam is in order to prevent the trade of the hazardous substances, pesticides, etc. Stockholm is for persistent organic pollutants, right? So that is the view of all these various conventions. Starting with the Vienna Convention. Vienna Convention for the protection of ozone layer. Now, the meeting for the convention happened in 1985. Right, it was signed in 1985, came into force in 1988. This was in order to prevent the ozone hole from expanding, because in early 80s, the ozone hole was expanding in terms of its area. And that was a persistent problem and a very huge problem, because that meant large areas of the planet were being exposed to UV rays. And those ultraviolet rays have a debilitating impact not only on human health because it causes skin lesions, skin cancer, but at the same time damages the marine life, damages the plants, and also the various different species involved. So that was the Vienna Convention. Now, for the protection of ozone layer, you need the ozone depleting substances like CFCs, etc. to be banned, their usage to be prevented in a timely manner. So, for that, what would be needed? A protocol would be needed. And the protocol for the Vienna Convention is what we know as the Montreal Protocol. Montreal Protocol was finalized in 1987, came into effect in 1989. It was about basically preventing the amount of emissions or the release of various different anthropogenic ozone depleting substances like chlorofluorocarbons, hydrochlorofluorocarbons, bromofluorocarbons, and so on, because these will deplete the ozone layer. Now, Montreal Protocol over the ages have gone through multiple amendments. You had the London Amendment, Copenhagen Amendment, again the case of Montreal Amendment almost 10 years later in 1997. 1999 you had the Beijing Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. But all of these tinkered with which gases to be included, which gases to be removed. The most major amendment to the Montreal Protocol took place around 2016, when you had the signing of the Kigali Amendment. Now, the Kigali Amendment is important, right? It entered into force in 2019 and it talked about elimination of HFC, hydrofluorocarbon, which in the early 80s, in the early 90s was cited as a replacement of CFC and HCFC. But this hydrofluorocarbon also has a global warming potential. It warms the planet. So, Kigali Amendment seeks to put a ban to the HFC usage and thereby prevent warming from happening. But the genius of Kigali Amendment again was the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. The developed nations, they were clubbed into one group, the developing into another, and the tropical and underdeveloped nations into the third group. And different targets were set for each one of them. So basically, rich and developed countries, they were put in the first group where they have to reduce the emissions by 2036. Then the second group, China, Brazil, and some of the other emerging countries, they have to put a cap to it by 2045. And then countries like India to achieve the target by 2047. So that was the case of Kigali Amendment, which again made it easy to implement and acceptable to the various different countries as well. Now, after this, you basically come to the Basel Convention. What is the Basel Convention about? Now, at the end of it, I will provide you with the compilation of each one of them, so that just so that there is too much of information, you might get confused. Don't worry, I will provide you with the recap as well. So, Basel Convention, control of transboundary movement of hazardous waste. So what used to be the practice in general through the 70s, 60s, 80s, 90s and early 2000s as well? Developed countries, when they had a lot of accumulated waste, they did not have enough land area to degrade or to store that waste. What they would do? They would sell that waste, or in a way provide that waste to underdeveloped nations so that they can extract whatever they can. Now, as a consequence of that, the underdeveloped or developing nations ended up getting materials like asbestos, lead acid, and so on, which would be absolutely damaging on human health but also environment. So that is what Basel Convention targeted for. Now, Basel Convention also included prior informed or prior consent approval, right? That if a country is sending some hazardous material to another country, the other country has to have a prior consent approval, that you agree that these are the content I am sending and you are okay with that. So that is very much required. Okay. Now, these are some of the waste under the Basel Convention. So if you take a look at it, biomedical waste, consumed and exhausted lead acid batteries, then organic pollutant waste, then PCB compounds, heat exchange fluids, all of these, right? So even mercury waste, ship waste, all of that is included in this. Okay, so that is included under the Basel Convention. Then when we come to the Rotterdam Convention, Rotterdam Convention is basically, again, why? To prevent the prior informed consent, to prevent the international trade in hazardous chemicals and pesticides. So that first was what? Basel was transboundary movement, not trade, that I am just sending it, right? This is for international trade, that nobody should be trading in those banned chemicals, the chemicals which are banned, administered by FAO and UNEP. UNEP was set up when? 1972, as a consequence of Stockholm Conference. Okay. Now here again you have Annex 3 chemicals and the list which is done. So covers those pesticides and industrial chemicals that are banned or severely restricted owing to their damaging conditions. Any concern related to these chemicals, that is covered under the list of the convention. Okay. Now, then you have the Stockholm Convention. Stockholm Convention is for POPs, persistent organic pollutants. For example, consider the case of chemical fertilizers. Some of the chemical fertilizers, pesticides, etc., like DDT, for example. Now, they will, in a way, be absorbed by the plants also. Now, the plants will consist of those chemicals. They are organic in nature. So, they will be long lasting. They won't degrade naturally. And you and I, we will consume those plants and we will get contaminated over a period of time. So, we will be definitely impacted. So, that is why the persistent organic pollutants, they result in contamination by the process of bioaccumulation or biomagnification in the food chain. And that is where they are very, very damaging. So, various pesticides, generally pesticides and insecticides are what are targeted. They are included in the list of POPs which are banned. Now, here you have the POPs into 3 annexes. Annex 1, POPs to be eliminated, Annex 2, POP to be restricted, and Annex 3, POP which is produced unintentionally as a result of another industrial process or another chemical reaction. It is released unintentionally. Do you have to learn the list about it? No. If it is in current affairs, definitely. Okay. Then the last of the convention is the Minamata Convention. Minamata Convention is about mercury poisoning, controlling the emission of mercury in the entire life cycle. For example, at the stage of mining, at the stage of production, at the stage of consumption. Anywhere if there is mercury contamination, it has to be stopped, right? So, this is basically because the Minamata disease spread for the first time in the region of Japan, and that was because of mercury poisoning. So, here, international treaty designed to protect human health in general and environment from anthropogenic release of mercury. So, the various cycles, entire life cycle of mercury, that is production, usage, marketing, consumption, and so on. Signed in 2013, entered into force in 2017. India is definitely a member of that. Okay. So, the convention covers all aspects of the life cycles of mercury. India ratified it in 2018 and is the 93rd member. Very important. Countries that have ratified the convention are bound by international law to put controls in place to prevent mercury contamination. Okay. So, that basically is about all the conventions. Now, let us go for a quick recap. So, how do we go for a recap? First of all, convention and protocol we all know. So, have 3 divisions for the classification of convention. Convention associated to climate and environment. Convention associated with biodiversity. And then convention associated with pollution. After all, ozone depleting substances like fluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, they are also pollutants. So, under this, which are the conventions you can start with? Start with Ramsar Convention, because that is for conservation of environment. Then you have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was arrived at Rio Summit. For biodiversity, conservation on initially start with CITES. Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, 1973. Then you have Bonn Convention or Convention on Migratory Species. Then you have the Convention on Biological Diversity. Right? Here you can also list United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Then the convention associated with pollution. Which are those? Vienna Convention for ozone depleting substances and ozone hole. Then after that you have Rotterdam, Basel for the hazardous substances. Rotterdam is for trade in hazardous substances. Basel is for transboundary movement, right? Basel. Stockholm for persistent organic pollutants. And then you basically have the Minamata, right? So in total, and I'm only including the conventions, I'm not bringing the protocols into the picture. If you have to bring protocols, first of all, get comfortable with these things, right? If you have to bring the protocols into picture, we will talk about that as well. So how many conventions are we covering here? We are covering around 5, 3, and 3. 11 conventions, all that is required for your exam. If you have to talk about the protocols, Ramsar Convention has got Paris Protocol. Then UNFCCC has got Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, right? Then CBD has got Cartagena and Nagoya, okay? And then Vienna has got the Montreal Protocol, okay? These are the various different conventions, okay? Now, a recap associated with climate aspect, which is going to be relevant for your examination. Climate conventions are generally more important. So basically, start with the Stockholm Conference. Stockholm, 1971, 1972. Before that, you had the Ramsar Convention of 1971. So Stockholm of 1972. Now then, 1987, you have the Brundtland Report. Brundtland Report. Brundtland Report on Sustainable Development. Then after that, 1988, you have the formation of IPCC. Then after that, 1992, you have the Rio Summit or the Earth Summit. That is where you basically arrive at the 3 documents, that is the Rio Declaration, Forest Principle and Agenda 21. And simultaneously, you have the 3 conventions, UNFCCC, UNCCD and CBD. Now, if we consider Framework Convention on Climate Change, because we are considering the list for climate, that is where you have in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol at the 3rd Conference of Party. You have the Kyoto Protocol, right? Then after that, you basically have the Doha Amendment in 2012, which extended the plan period. 2012 Doha Amendment. Okay. And then after that, you basically had in 2015 the Paris Agreement. And the Conference of Parties, they keep on happening. The Conference of Party number 21 was in Paris Agreement. It was in 2021, Conference of Parties number 26, where India declared its net zero ambition for 2070. India declared its Panchamrit goals. That is where it becomes important. And lately, recently in 2024, you had the COP number 29, which was held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Okay, so that is the timeline for all the climate convention and the protocol associated. So like that, do revise this, take a look at the PYQs as well, and simultaneously we will cover the portion of the current affairs associated with these also in the later stages of Conquer Prelims, and also bring about the concept and the chronology of national legislations from Wildlife Protection Act to the Forest Conservation Act, the Plastic Waste Management Amendment. All of that we will talk about in the coming videos and the coming sessions. I hope Overall, this session has been productive. You are able to extract the meaningful aspects and help your preparation along the way. If you have liked this particular session, please don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button and let us know about your feedback in the comment section. Till we meet again, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.